Let's talk about CI/CD success. Let's start with a little thought exercise. Can you imagine or recall the last time you shipped some software? Something you worked on for maybe a matter of hours, maybe a matter of days, maybe a matter of months. I hope not longer. Anyway, you're ready to ship something. You're ready to get this in the hands of your users, and everything is ready. Like, you've got your test passing, you've got your everyone who needs to give a thumbs up has given a thumbs up. Everything is ready. So you just need to press this big red button. So yeah, you press the big red button. It has a nice tactile click. That's an audible and audible click and tactile feedback, like a nice mechanical keyboard. And then it's off to the races. What this means is deployment is being initiated, and the thing is out of your control. It's out of your hands. You've done your job, and all you can do is sit back, relax, hold your breath, and then you have two options. Option one, you want to nervously wait and keep holding your breath until you go blue in the face, which is not healthy, by the way. Waiting if it's going to start showing errors on your users' dashboards, with your users. Or option B, this works much better if it's a Friday. But yeah, if it's a Friday afternoon, imagine it's a Friday afternoon, you pack up, go home, and enjoy your weekend. So I don't know about you, I much prefer option B. It's much more pleasant in every way. But the difference between the two is just boils down to automation. And it always boils down to automation. Whatever industry, whatever field we're talking about, see that? So yeah, from software to manufacturing to processes, and yes, to agriculture. So yeah, even with agriculture, this is not an agricultural talk. I like to compare this with DevOps and CI/CD in particular. Everything will be revealed why. But yeah, if you imagine you have this big field, you could do everything manually. You can do everything by just employing maybe a few hundred people to plant everything, to pick everything up, to do everything you need to do with a field in order to make it grow crops. Of course, that's not efficient, and it's not very reproducible. Of course, you can avoid that by employing some means of automation, like tractors. You can get automated plows, you can get harvesters to help you do things with fewer people, much more predictable. You can put irrigation systems, again, fewer people, much more predictable, independent of external factors like weather. Or you can go a few steps further, like invest in this super high-tech greenhouse which controls everything up to humidity, temperature, light, nutrients that get fed to each individual plant, maybe even air temperature and so on. And I imagine these big robot hands that you see here are use computer vision to help you detect which plants are their ripest so that you can pick them up and sell them for the highest profit. And that's a really fine-tuned CI/CD process, because you account for every single variable that's out there. You account for everything that can be accounted for in order to make this otherwise wild and really unpredictable process much more predictable and reproducible. But of course, sometimes machines misbehave. Sometimes machines turn into giant robot dinosaurs that overthrow humanity. Probably those robot hands won't do it, and probably your CI/CD system also won't do it. But they can definitely ruin your crops, and they can definitely ruin your day and your user's day in the case of malfunctioning deployment or CI/CD system. But fret not, it's never the machine's fault. It's always us, right? And with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Zan Markan. I'm a developer advocate at CircleCI, and yes, I have broken many pieces of software, many builds in my career, and I hopefully have learned something about it. As I said, I'm a developer advocate at CircleCI. We are a CI/CD platform, the biggest in the world, and we help projects, teams, organizations all over the world build software better and faster and more effectively. In the JavaScript space, you might have heard of Angular. That's built with CircleCI, and yeah, a bunch of projects, a bunch of tools in the open source space, in the other industries, and yeah, not only in the web, not only in JavaScript, but also in any type of other technology. But this is not a talk about CircleCI. This is a talk about CI/CD in general, and the rest of the talk is going to be very general, independent of which CI/CD tool you might be using, independent of how far you are in the process. I'll be kind of just giving out various tips and tricks for making different aspects of it better and being more successful with it. But first, let's untangle the acronyms. So CI/CD stands for continuous integration and continuous delivery or deployment, where CI part of this is essentially automatically merging and testing and validating and building your software on any change that gets committed or merged into a particular shared repository. So for example, you push some code to GitHub, CI part of the CI/CD picks it up, executes a bunch of tests, verifications, unit tests, functional tests, integration tests, whatnot, and ultimately results in a built application. That could be a Docker image, that could be a mobile application, that could be a static website, that could be a Rails application. It doesn't really matter as long as it's built with some kind of source code and then some programming languages, tools, and whatnot. What's important here is that, yeah, this happens as part of your development process. So you are committing code, this triggers automatically. And the way that we configure and define everything is done through code, which is also committed as part of that repository. And at Circle, we use YAML to kind of configure all of those CI/CD pipelines and basically tell it, run these tests, run these kind of security scans, run the static code analysis, shrink this code, make it ready for deployment, and so on. The resulting artifact is a built application, built static site, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter because it just takes whatever. The other important thing is that it's running in predefined or what you define as a runtime. So this could be a Docker container based on a specific image, or it could be a virtual machine, or it could be a bunch of other things. But important thing is that, yeah, you spin this up when this process starts. So you always get the same results on that same commit, because yes, the configuration is part of that. In the configuration, you define where everything is set up. And yeah, if all the tests are passing, all the build is passing, it should always pass for that particular commit. And again, if it doesn't pass, if it fails for whatever reason, tests failing, build scripts failing, it should always fail for that specific commit. So you got this level of reproducibility, which is super, super valuable, like that greenhouse. And then once you have this build artifact finished, you go on to the continuous deployment step, which is all about automatically getting that to our user environments. So that could be our production users, that could be our testers, that could be our staging environment, dev environment, any other type of environment you might want to deploy this to. Maybe a preview build for if it's a website, you want to do a PR previews. That's again continuous deployment in practice, in action. And yeah, there's a lot more scripting, a lot less build tool specifics, but ultimately you have a few steps in there that very much depend on whatever you're building, however you're building it, and so on. But yeah, this is the acronyms. This is what we're talking about. And as you can imagine, this is quite a complex bit of technology, quite a complex bit of processes. So let's disentangle that into multiple different dimensions and talk about how to be successful in each one of those. The first one that's obvious, quite obvious for anyone who's ever encountered a CI/CD tool is how fast does it actually go? Because we want it to go as fast as possible, because we want to get that feedback telling us all of our tests have passed or failed as soon as possible, so that we're not blocking pull requests, we're not blocking someone's workflow. But that's only one part of it. The other part is how quickly can we recover from a build that has failed. For example, we've merged something and now our main branch isn't building anymore. It is failing because of whatever reason. So that's bad, because we can't deploy any quick fixes because it's blocking all the other kind of further steps down the chain, like yes, deployment. So we can't get any new code to production until we fix that failing build. Third one is more organizational. It's more like, how long does it take us to ship a feature? So let's say we need to add a Christmas theme to our application, to our website. How long do we need to get that done? So with CI/CD, it kind of shortens your development and deployment times, so you can actually ship something like that a lot faster because it's all tested throughout the process. And lastly, less obvious but very important, how long it takes us to onboard a new team member. With something like configuration as code, we can essentially tell a new team member to read that configuration, look at that YAML, understand these are the verification, these are the tests, checks we're doing, and this is the environment that we're deploying to. It's pretty obvious from the configuration, and then that person can actually go back to us and say, hey, I have questions about these 4 things, instead of just having everything as a blank slate. So yeah, a couple of aspects within speed dimension. Going in deeper in the running pipelines faster, there's a few things we can do. So first one is using the right size resources. So depending on what your build tool is, you might use one kind of concurrent thread, or it might be able to use multiple threads, or it might consume a lot of RAM. So it's good practice to try and allocate as much resource to your to whatever is building your project, whatever is running your tests, so that it can do that as fast as possible. It's a bit of a trial and error kind of thing. So see, yes, I can get X performance with 8 gigs of RAM and 16 cores. I can get X.1 performance with twice that. So find the balance that works for you. Second one is utilizing something like cache. Cache is nothing but deduplicating work. So if you've installed your NPM packages once, you've downloaded them from the web, and you realize that bloody thing is 3 gigs on disk, you can probably get that saved somewhere in a cache and not download it every single time, because if your package.log doesn't change, you're good usually. The same with some pre-built binaries. So if you've got like some functional test that you want to run on an application that you already built, maybe build that once, pass it down the chain in your build, and run those tests on something that you've already kind of created, so you don't have to like redo the whole build process again and again and again. So that's all types of caching you can do. Thirdly, you can run things in parallel. And jobs is one thing you can run in parallel, and that's like different types of tests, different types of security scans, different types of builds that you want to run in parallel. Because if you use a cloud-based CI/CD tool, then it's quite easy to get to just provision multiple resources to do things in parallel. The next one is running tests in parallel. If you've got, like, for example, a long running test suite that kind of runs functional tests that poke your screen or imaginary screen, testing every single kind of user flow of your application, that can take a while. That can take half an hour, it can take hours. And for that, you can actually think about splitting those tests across further parallel jobs. So each job will run a subset of all the tests. So there's tools and tricks we can employ there, but essentially think about how you can pass subset of all the tests that you want to run to each of those parallel jobs and do that. Circle does this quite automatically, so it's pretty cool, but yeah, depending on what tool you're using, there's going to be different things you'll need to do. And lastly, pick what needs to run when. So some things you don't need to run on every single commit. Some things you can run nightly, for example, if you got especially extensive test suites. Obviously, things do break sometimes. And how do we recover from failures? Or better, how do we use a CI/CD tool to recover from failures? First one is understand how is it going to tell you what's broken. So where to look into what's broken. So every tool has some kind of dashboard. Every tool has some kind of way to log things. So really understand where you can get those insights of what's happening with your builds to kind of pinpoint the location of where the failure was. Logging helps depending on what build tool, what platform, what language you're using. There's going to be different aspects of how you're going to log things. Maybe it's something wrong with your TypeScript compiler. Maybe it's Webpack. Maybe it's something else. Just understand like how we're going to turn on the verbose mode to kind of get to the bottom of this as quickly as possible. And then also get access to those logs so that we can actually grab through them on our local machine as opposed to scrolling through a log output in a browser, because that's just annoying. And lastly, if you have this ability, try to debug your builds as they have failed. So with Circle, we have this ability to SSH into broken builds. So you have a job that's failed for whatever reason. Maybe it's test that failed. Maybe it's something else that's failed. You can SSH into that running container and explore it, run some tests locally, see what the environment is like as you were working on a local machine, which is super useful and always helpful to kind of get to the bottom of where the issue lies. But of course, I mentioned that it's a race in the beginning, but it's not really a race. CI/CD speed is to be seen more as an ambulance instead. So it should go as fast as possible, but still not too fast, because whatever payload is carrying, all your test information is the actual signal, because it's telling you how healthy your application is. So yeah, find the balance that works and go with it. And yes, of course, when you see the red lights that are flashing in your application, go fix it as fast as possible. Speaking of things you shouldn't let break at any point in any case is security. And how can CI/CD tools help us make our applications more secure? First one, most important, keeping our credentials outside of the Git repositories. I shouldn't be telling that, but people need to know that. People need to hear that repeatedly. We can actually use a CI tool to inject those credentials, API keys, whatnot at build time. So whenever they're actually needed. Until then, they're stored, encrypted on the CI side and not stored in a Git repository. Second one is we can use tools that are out there to automate our security scanning. So scan our package.json dependencies, maybe scan our Docker containers as they are built, whatever we're doing, there's ways we can scan this for malware packages that have been compromised, or dependencies of dependencies of dependencies that have been compromised. There's a bunch of tools out there that are really good at that, and it's very easy to include that as part of your build and have it break your build if it's kind of compromising some security aspect of your application. And lastly, think about whether you can employ some kind of privilege access policy and split responsibilities between parts of your CI/CD pipeline. So for example, whatever builds your software doesn't need credentials to your AWS production account, for example. So think how you can split that access and responsibilities. And that's going to be very easy for you, or you're gonna get more done with that in terms of security as with many other things. And then look at what we can do beyond the actual CI/CD tool. Especially with teams that have implemented like CI/CD pipelines maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, they can forget about this because it works. Why bother? Let's just forget about this. It keeps building, we're good. But maybe there's tools out there that are now part of your platform that you could be using. So read through the release notes every few months and understand, yes, maybe there's something in there that we could use. And then also think about whether you're using any external services as part of your software development flow, like project management tracking or dashboards that kind of monitor your entire application in production, and see whether we can integrate that through webhooks, through something else, to kind of get deployment information straight into a ticket that opened a bug. So say, hey, this has been fixed. Here's the deployments. This is done. Developers are satisfied. And also, yeah, inform whoever needs to be informed. So if it's an ops team that needs to be informed and they live on Slack, or they have some kind of pager system out there, integrate that. Ping them whenever they need to be pinged, or Slack them. And that's all part of things you could also be doing that aren't necessarily verifying your application or doing your deployment, but still valid to your team and to your wider organization. Speaking of team, DevOps talks always have to talk about teams, by the way. CI/CD is a team responsibility. We should always be looking at spreading that knowledge, because A, it avoids bottlenecks, and that should be enough reason for anyone, because anyone on the team should be able to contribute, or at least understand what the tool is about, how to use the tool, and really implement improvements, implement suggestions for it, or at least fix something if it breaks. And I mentioned in the beginning that CI/CD configuration can definitely be used as an onboarding aid. But yes, remember that story of deployment from the beginning, and all of our tests have passed, all of our automation was in place, but we still broke at something. So, and that's just reality of life. Broken deploys will happen. They will happen to anyone, everyone, wherever. You can just minimize the risk of them happening, but you still need to be prepared for them to happen. So, if that still happens, we can still use our CI/CD tool to enable fast recovery and revert quickly, because if we manage to deploy the previous release without a glitch from a previous commit, we can just revert to that commit and then trigger the deployment again, and we're good. In case of most websites, that's all you need to do. Obviously, if you've got databases and migrations that you're dealing with, it might be a bit more difficult, or a lot more difficult, but it could be as simple as that. And it also allows you to favor smaller changes as opposed to larger multi-month release cycles, because you can just have everything tested all the time and verified all the time, so you can actually trigger deployment much, much more often. But the best way to deal with broken deployments is to actually plan for them, understand how you're going to react, how your team is going to do, what your team is going to do, and practice. Every 3 months, do a dry run. Let's see how we're dealing with a broken deployment scenario. And that is it. We've covered quite a lot of aspects, from speed to security to reverting broken deployments and a few other things. But ultimately, to be successful with CI/CD to me means that we are free to really focus on quality, focus on delivering software that works for our users, and also helps our team be more successful and more happier, which is always valuable. It also allows our organizations to ship things faster and adapt to change in the world faster, which is beneficial, to say the least. And you get a few things for free as well, like self-documenting release process, which is, yeah, very useful if teams change, and also be able to recover from failures. And that's my talk on practical tips on CI/CD success. I hope you find something useful in it. I'm happy to take some questions if there's some.
So at the moment, a lot of the stuff you spoke about, you probably deal with them with CircleCI.
Yeah, I've got mine
You
here.
have it? Okay, good. Yeah, so tell us a bit, like, what kind of, like, real world scenarios you're facing and you've seen, and where you managed to come across and fix those kind of things with the stuff you talk about.
I mean, there is always, every month or a few months, there is like a big security vulnerability leak due to some stupid dependency thing. So,
like British Airways,
for example, yeah.
Yeah.
For example, I don't want to name names, but
yeah, that's quite well known in the industry, isn't it?
And there is just like stuff like that that's probably the most pressing, because it gets to the news all the time, or quite frequently, and when it gets to the news, it's very, very negative.
Could you give us an example without naming the company of something that happened recently, to make it a bit more nice for the audience that are watching us? If you want, of course. I mean, I'm not going to push you.
I can give an example. There was something that kind of leaked credentials in a deployment processes. That was maybe a few months ago as well, more recent than British Airways, and it was like thousands of teams were affected.
Okay.
And it's something that could be avoided through privilege.
Yeah. Okay. So
privilege and that kind of stuff.
If these guys had the CircleCI, what could they have done so that it wouldn't have happened? Can you tell us a bit about?
Split context, for example, like have your deployment credentials in one context, which has access to a certain tier of environment variables, and have, for example, your other tools like that touch only the build process in another part of the in another context, so that you're not kind of like mixing credentials, because you don't want to do access to your environments.
And what about performance? Like, because one other feature is going to be performance, right? So can you tell us a bit about how, for example, using CircleCI, there are a lot of alternatives, but because you own that domain, you're a domain expert, right?
One would hope.
Yeah.
So performance-wise, I think people really underestimate the value of caching.
Yes.
And I know in Node, with NPM, you have the NPM CI, for example, which explicitly avoids caching anything, because it wants to kind of download everything. But if you run NPM install on a React application, you're looking at 20, 30 seconds if you're lucky, right? But you can easily just cache those dependencies and avoid that every single commit you do, every single build you do. So that's one example. The other one is splitting of tests. Like if you have a test suite that runs for, I don't know, more than 5-10 minutes, it's worth thinking about splitting some part of those tests, so that you run a subset of them and run them faster. because like you can get 20 minutes builds down to like 2 minutes across 10 builds, for example, 10 jobs.
I mean, from like obviously all this has an impact on the team that they are working, so they don't have to really
Absolutely
do the manual deployments. They can just rely on that. Maybe you can deploy on a Friday.
Hopefully
Right?
you can
Yeah.
deploy on a Friday. That's
Yeah.
that's a dream, right? That's the
Yeah,
dream.
that's a dream.
Because you're not, you know exactly what you're gonna be. You know exactly that the changes you are deploying are small enough not to make a big difference, and they're also reversible because you can just kind of go back to the previous commit and fix it.
And the last question before we go to the next speaker, it's like you probably know what is the future of CI/CD. Anything new that is coming out that you could leak in our meetup? What is the new stuff that you guys at CircleCI you are working on? Not the reInvent conference from with AWS, but probably a lot of these things will come out there. But since you are here, we would like to hear a bit from you.
I don't think we are announcing anything too drastic at reInvent, but one cool thing we've just put into open preview is scheduled pipelines, so you can actually implement scheduling for builds like nightlies or hourlies or multiple times per hour very easily. So that's like one that's very, very fresh, very, very useful.
Nightly, really, so you can go sleep and then that does the job for you.
Nightly builds, I would
Yes.
call them. Because
Okay.
you want to run tests nightly as opposed to release things nightly. Or maybe if you
Okay.
have a library package, you might deploy like snapshots nightly, for example.
Okay.
So it kind of takes the current changes in main and the current state of main and just kind of builds that, deploys that. So whoever is kind of consuming that, if it's a library, can get that right away, basically.
Okay, that's perfect.
Kind of building
Yeah.
that. So that's like a scheduled pipeline. That's like something that's coming up.
That's very good.
Very soon.
Yeah, that's also my questions. There are no questions from the audience, so probably they're happy with my questions.
Great.
Do you have a question? Oh yeah, we have a question from the audience. George.
Thanks for the talk. That was really good. I've got I guess from a business perspective, right? We obviously do a lot of CI/CD. Often there's it's like a two-part question. One is, at what point is there a point where you know that the manual deployment's got to go and CI/CD is the way forward and when to invest?
Yeah, before you start.
But on the other side, then the second question is, some of the large corporations we have, it's not their main piece that might come to. It might be a very quick MVP, a POC, but some of them are really, you have to use our pipes. You've got to do it this way. What's your view on, should you actually invest in that and keep it as part of the main sort of CI/CD strategy they have? Or is it okay to veer from that, to either test something out or to, if it's almost like a startup inside of the organization? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, if the organization is using CircleCI, obviously you should keep using that. No, I honestly think it really depends on the project. Like whatever the clients or the whole organization wants or whatever the strategy is, I don't think you should like go out of it unless you're kind of like you have that kind of organizational permission for that. Because last thing I want to do is just like cause havoc in the industry by telling everyone to rebel. But yeah, like I mean, smaller changes are kind of usually fine. But then again, it all depends on organizations.
Thank you.